Minasan konnichiwa, Ari desu. Hi everyone, my name is Ali. Welcome or welcome back to the channel, and today we're discussing how I am currently improving my Japanese vocabulary in 2024. After getting the JLPT N1 last year, I can say that my current level in Japanese is advanced. However, it doesn't mean that I think it is perfect. Far from it, I still have to improve on a lot of aspects in the language. While my current input level in Japanese is very high, my output level is still quite low, at least in my opinion. So essentially, I can understand the language much more than I can produce it myself. One way I am tackling this issue this year is by expanding my vocabulary knowledge, since the lack of vocabulary is usually what I find is the most significant obstacle when I go about making my own sentences in the language. In detail, I would say that I have two specific problems with my vocab in Japanese today. The first one is that I lack vocab range, so I'm always using the same words, and I lack knowledge of specialized words. But the second problem I have is lack of vocab retrieval practice. I know a lot of words, and especially I've learned a lot of new words during the past year, but I rarely use them because I'm not used to recalling them in certain circumstances. So these two areas are the ones that I'm focusing on this year. A quick note before we start. You will notice that in this video I am not mentioning anything about flashcards or tools like Anki using the SRS method, the spaced repetition method. And this is only because I am not using those in my study routine, and they have almost never been a part of my study routines in the first place for language learning. However, I just wanted to tell you that beforehand so that you guys are not surprised by the lack of mention of these tools, especially if you are using them yourself, because I know they are quite popular. However, this kind of systematic study method is not one for me. I much prefer something that resembles natural acquisition. I find that those are not really adapted to my study method and that I get distracted quite quickly. I lose my focus and I don't find them engaging at all. This is why during this video I will not talk about any reviewing method of the vocab words I encounter during each of my study routines, because I much prefer natural repetition occurring while I encounter the same words over and over again through my different study routines and using my different study resources and immersion resources. So instead, today we'll cover the 3 study routines I currently have in place for my vocab acquisition in Japanese specifically. I am not giving you advice on how to improve your vocabulary. I'm simply in today's video telling you what I'm doing to improve my Japanese vocabulary, and we will cover them one by one in this video. My active studying routine, my immersion practice routine, and finally my output practice routine. During these study routines, I am using a unique dictionary app. I've been using the Yume app for years now, and I've been recommending it to you guys for years as well. It helps me look up any word I want, any kanji I want in Japanese. The app actually has a way to save words onto study lists, which can then transform into flashcards. However, I almost never use this functionality, and I only end up consulting my lists once in a while, just to remind myself of what's in them and discard the words that I already know and don't need saved in there anymore. So now that that's cleared out, let me tell you guys what each routine is about. Alright, so let's start with my Japanese vocab active study routine. What I call active studying is studying that uses specific study resources for the particular area of the language that we are talking about. In this case, vocab acquisition. So I will be talking about vocab textbooks and in general vocab study resources. I use 2 types of resources here. I use resources that are designed for the JLPT exam, and I use resources that are meant for Japanese natives. So why am I still using resources that are meant for the JLPT even though I'm actually done with the JLPT technically? Well, this is because even though I passed the JLPT N1 last year, so the last level of the exam, I actually still own resources, study resources for vocab that I still haven't gone through yet and which I want to go through before discarding them. So essentially that's what I'm doing this year, and that's not the only reason why I'm doing it. It's also because I definitely have not covered all of the vocab required for the JLPT N1 before sitting the exam last year. So this year in 2024 I'm essentially bridging the gap here. And the last reason why I'm using the resources I still own for JLPT is because I see those resources as the last stepping stone, the last step before moving on fully to resources meant for Japanese natives. So how am I covering those resources? I'm essentially going through textbooks or other type of study resources once from cover to cover with the intention of retaining as much information as possible from my first read of the resource. And then if I have anything left after this first read that I still don't know, I go over the resource again and review it at least once until I feel comfortable enough with the resource to discard it. When it comes to which resources I'm using, so the vocab related JLPT resources I still own are my Shinkansen Master for N1 Kanji, which I just finished, so this one I will be reviewing once and then discarding. Then I have my Power Doriru for N1 Vocab, so this is a prep book for the exam, and I'm actually going through it a second time before discarding it. I'm doing it at the moment. And then lastly, I have the Shinkansen Master for N1 Vocab. This one I have not touched at all, and I will go through it before the end of this year. So that's it for my JLPT resources. Let's move on to the non-JLPT resources I'm using for active studying of my Japanese vocab. First, why is it crucial for me to use vocab resources meant for Japanese natives? It's essentially to get an idea of, first of all, the differences between the JLPT resources and the non-JLPT resources, to see the gaps there, because the knowledge, especially the vocab required of non-native speakers, is not at all the same as the knowledge expected of native speakers of the language. So I'm comparing the two by using resources in both categories, and in the future this is a gap that I hope to bridge myself, and I hope to get closer to a native or near native vocabulary range and knowledge, instead of, keeping my vocab close to the JLPT level. How am I going through those resources? Well, essentially I use the same method as the one I use for my JLPT resources. However, the only difference is that I will not be discarding those resources for the foreseeable future, because I want to keep them as reference materials. So after I go through them, and even when I get comfortable with the contents of those resources, I will not be discarding them. So I will be keeping them for the foreseeable future. Which resources am I talking about? So essentially I have two resources that I own at the moment. One resource which is an exercise book, Tokinagara Minitsukeru Otona no Goiryoku. This is meant for Japanese adults. And then I have another resource which is 15歳までに知っておきたい言葉 1800. This one is really a vocab book, and I have covered about 70% of this book, and I will cover the last 30% before the end of the year. And there are probably more resources that I will get, and in the future the amount of resources for natives I own will probably increase until I feel comfortable enough to not use them anymore for active studying. But right now I only have two mainly, and in terms of priority, I want to prioritize my JLPT resources just to get, comfortable with those, and then get rid of them just to make space also on my bookshelf, and then move on to full-on native resources for Japanese vocab range expansion. The second study routine I have for my vocab improvement in Japanese is, of course, my immersion practice. You guys see me do that pretty much every single week, and especially when you see me do that during vlogs. I read a lot in Japanese, and I also watch a lot of things and listen to a lot of things. I keep myself surrounded with the language as much as I can to keep myself in this bubble of Japanese. And especially at my level now, I feel like this is absolutely crucial for me to keep challenging myself and to keep hearing new things, new words, and hopefully through that exposition get more and more comfortable with more and more sentence structures, but also vocab words, of course. So the goal here is to feel so comfortable with the language that I will be able to understand anything that anyone tells me in any context. And that not only that, but I will also be able with time to discuss any topic with the correct language level and with the correct words. So how am I doing this immersion each week? I really have two types of immersion that I'm doing: passive immersion and active immersion. My passive immersion is really me reading extensively any type of thing. It can be non-fiction books, it can be manga, it can be other types of comics, it can be novels, anything really. And it's also me watching drama episodes or films or TV programs, anything that I don't feel the need to listen to, watch or read intensively to understand 100% of those. So I alternate between this kind of immersion practice and more intense immersion practice in all forms. So again, reading, but also watching and listening. And when I do intensive immersion practice, I do look up all the words that I don't know and the words that I'm not sure about, the words that I can't read, or the words that I kind of remember but don't really remember. So I really alternate between those two practices. This works well for me. When we dive deeper into what I do exactly when I'm listening to something intensively or I'm reading something more intensively, essentially I take this opportunity to look for more advanced, specialized or rare vocab. In my case, you guys know that I'm always looking for specialized vocabulary in the fields of science just because I am interested in knowing those words. Any specialized word that you generally come across in journal articles, in news articles, I would be interested in knowing because those words are known by the whole population. So those are words that I would want to know myself, right? When it comes to the resources I'm using here, essentially I'm using anything I can find, whether it is books, comics, whether it is YouTube channels, Netflix shows, TV shows, anything I can find really. And finally, the last routine I have in place is my output practice routine. Why do I make a specific point about output? Is because active studying combined with immersion practice is great. It's already very good. However, I believe it is not enough. Anything I input, I must also learn to output myself. So essentially, all the vocab words I know, all the vocab words I'm learning through all of this input study practice, I must also learn to reuse myself using output methods. So all of that to say that I must practice my speaking more and I must also practice my written expression more. That's essentially it. In general, it's fair to say that I lack a lot of practice there, whether in oral form or written form, especially written form. And I was very painfully aware of this for the past few years. However, I was really focusing on prioritizing the GLPT examination and getting to an N1 level after it became clear that I would move here to Japan, and I really wanted to get to that level almost before I actually came here. And so since the GLPT exam is not focused at all on output skills and only focused on input skills and testing your general comprehension levels of the language, I find now that I must, from this year, I absolutely must bridge the gap here in my use of the language, and that I must get as comfortable as possible with my output, my production of the language. That's why I'm focusing on this part this year. So how am I doing this? Currently, for my oral expression practice, apart from my day-to-day use of the language and, making sure that I am speaking as best as I can in any setting, when I'm talking to my husband or when I'm talking to my friends, my dentist or the workers at the immigration office or the workers at the supermarket, I try to use the most correct expressions, the most correct words, and I just in general pay attention to how I'm using the language. So apart from my day-to-day use of the language, I practice my speaking skills actually on my own, by myself, because I'm not using any tutor at the moment. I will probably go back to using a tutor towards the end of the year or the beginning of next year. But currently I'm doing everything on my own. So each week when I get the time, I speak to myself for 10 to 15 minutes about a specific topic. So for example, I choose a topic about politics and I see whether I can talk about this for 10 minutes, you know what I mean? And then I record this or I dictate it on a document so that I can correct myself afterwards to see if I've made any mistakes there. So that's one way I'm doing it for my oral speech. And then finally, for my written expression skills, I am actually practicing them by writing a small essay in Japanese every week, or more essays if I can during the week. And for this specific practice, I will actually make a whole video about it so you guys will know everything I am doing to create my little essays, how I write them, how I correct them, how I find the topics, and how it's helping me develop my written expression skills in general. You guys will know exactly how I'm doing it. About the resources I'm actually not using any specific resources at the moment for either my oral expression practice or my written expression practice. However, I have them lined up, especially for my written expression skills. So about my written expression skills, I will definitely start using resources for that specifically, and that will be covered in a future video. But that will be it for today's video. I hope it was insightful and that you got a good idea of how I am improving my Japanese vocabulary this year, using which study routines, why, and what kind of resources. And on that note, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye bye! Mata ne!